Here again is another picture of a man, of a scholar. You know he's a scholar by the way kind of clothes he's wearing and the hat he has. And he's walking in the woods by himself. Another shot of this. And here's a shot of the previous two ones that we saw. You can see the man down below. And go back one. You can see this picture again. Back one more. And there's the man by himself. I want to say another word about the kind of Chinese paintings. We have in the Western world what we call still lives. Still lives might be a bowl of fruit or a bowl of flowers that are cut. The Chinese would not do that. They paint live objects. They don't paint dead fruit and dead flowers. The only exception to that is that they would sometimes paint at a funeral. They might paint the portrait of the man who is being buried. But we, in the Western world, will paint dead objects, which to the Chinese would be abhorrent. You paint live things. It's interesting, another thing that have you ever noticed that in pictures sometimes in the West, somebody will have shot a deer or an elk, and there he stands with his foot on the elk with a rifle in his hand, looking very proud of himself. This is what we do. Because it says in the Western world, man dominates nature. And the fact is when you have your foot on a dead animal, it illustrates the fact that you dominate nature. In Chinese paintings, you don't dominate nature. Nature is there. Be respected. Here's another picture of a plant. And again, there's not much painting there. And yet you're very conscious of the fact that there's a plant, and the leaves are very different. You notice how they kind of move around. They're not straight the way things are. Again, there's not much painting there per se. It's a beautiful picture to me of a frog on a lily pad. That white blossom in the background is an incredible picture. You can see that it's a blossom. But it's a brilliant color, but you don't see it at first or not notice it too much. And again, the lily pad is the way lily pads are. It's broken in spots, and that's the way they should be. There's a flower, chrysanthemum. Now you can tell the season of the year by the flowers. Chrysanthemums bloom in the fall. Certain flowers bloom in the spring. If you want to have a remembrance of a fall event, you would paint mums or some typical fall flower. If you wanted something in the spring to commemorate the spring, you might paint a spring flower then. So you can tell in part what time of year is being commemorated by this. This is an example of a duck. It's a kind of like an Audubon duck in a way. It's very precise. The man went out and looked at ducks. They tell the apocryphal story, which is undoubtedly not true, but that an emperor supposedly asked a man to paint a duck for him. And 2 years later on, the emperor asked the man, "Where is my duck?" And the man said, "I'm still trying to think like a duck." He wasn't being funny. When he went out and looked at ducks, he had to go back and paint a duck without looking at a duck again. So he had to think like a duck. And this obviously looks like a duck. It does not walk like a duck because it's not walking. But it's a live object. It's not a dead duck. This is an illustration of wind. How do you portray wind? And this is a bamboo, and you can tell it's windy there because it's being blown. And again, there is on the left side what I assume is a kind of a poem or writing of some kind that would illustrate the point of what this thing was. And so you'll find in the Chinese paintings this, to me, a brilliant ability to portray ideas by going back to your own little study and working at it. And another thing that is typical to Chinese is that when you were a scholar, that is, you could write, the hieroglyphics were art forms. So if you could write, you could also paint. If you were a painter, you could probably also write. And so the writing was reserved for the scholar class. I want to move for a little bit to the western part of China, where the Buddhists came in, and you find a number of Buddhist monuments there. And in the caves, or rather in the hillsides, they actually carved out caves where they would then live part of the time, or they would produce altars there. Incredible, the ability to carve caves on this difficult side. You can see in this picture of the caves you see above there, how they got up there to carve things and to build their altars. They have a series of what they call Bodhisattvas, a number of different Buddhas that they would carve in the rock itself. Here's one of the great Buddhas. Recently we had two of the Buddhas in Afghanistan destroyed by the Taliban. But here's one of the Buddhas. Here's a close-up of it. The plaster, to me, if you look at the plaster, the way it's been put on, you feel a feeling of really elegance about the way it folds. And the earlobes, the Buddhas oftentimes wore actually earrings, heavy earrings in their earlobes, so they were actually extended that way. So this is not artificially done, the way in which they would because of their wearing earrings. I think this hand illustrates to me one of the great Buddha's ability to show peace and contentment. This is in a cave in which they paint a number, or rather carve a number of figures. What they're trying to say is that in Buddhism, everything changes, nothing remains the same. How do you portray in stone change? And what they did here was, as the sun moved around from 1 minute, 1 second to the next, it changed the way light reflected. And so you could have an example of change by carving stone. Because as the sun moved, it would change the way in which it reflected on these figures. Another shot of one of the great Buddhas. We're now moving to Japan. And again, I want to show you some of the landscape because you can understand better Japanese paintings and what they're doing if you understand the landscape which they come. This is a picture where they use a lot of rocks. And we know the United States has been influenced by this. The number of people who put rocks in their gardens or in their yards or use rocks in other ways. The Japanese have done this for a number of years. And you can see they use here water and land and rocks, and there's a building too. But again, it doesn't dominate the way it does so much in the West. Although we'll see that the Japanese paintings and landscape is different than Chinese paintings. I can illustrate that by talking about the difference between Chinese food and Japanese food. And I love both. Chinese food tends to be more rich, varied, and complicated. Japanese food is much more simple in their presentation as well as in the kind of the way they cook the things. The same is true, we'll see, about the architecture of Japan, which is different than the Chinese architecture.